All right, so this is going to be a lecture that is going to be found in chapter 34 of your text, but I'm not really going to address really anything except for a small mention in chapter 34 that deals with the Holocaust. In fact, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to expand on a topic that is within the humanities and the study of the humanities, which is actually one of my areas of academic interest, which is Holocaust literature or studies of the Holocaust in general. So I wanted to just start by for one, saying that the Holocaust is what I think to be, and many scholars believe to be, the greatest atrocity and crime against humanity of the 20th century. And I don't say that with any reserve. In fact, for one, if you are anyone who's ever heard of any Holocaust denial, first of all, no scholar of any repute believes that the Holocaust is a myth or was exaggerated. There's a lot of Holocaust denial stuff on the internet, but most of it is myth-based, and it's driven by anti-Semitism, which is the very thing that is what spurred the Holocaust itself. So I would strongly encourage you to not be caught up by any of the deceptive stuff you find on the internet, and do research that pertains to the academic study of the event as a historical event, and look at it from that perspective, not what some Joe Schmo on the internet has said. I think the quote that comes to mind is the greatest lie the devil ever told was to convince the world that he didn't exist. And I think anti-Semitism and the Holocaust kind of fall into that category. I think if there was a great deception to be had, it would be to say that it didn't actually happen. But the truth is, it did happen. And in fact, in order to understand exactly what the Holocaust was, you need to have a grasp of really what anti-Semitism is. Anti-Semitism is a very nebulous, very abstract concept, but essentially it means anti or hatred for the Jews. But the funny thing is, even the word anti-Semite, Jews are not the only Semites, and other Semites don't get hated, and essentially Jews are not really Semitic. You don't have to be, there is no Jewish race. In fact, that was what was so baffling, really, about what Hitler set out to accomplish, is that there was no Jewish race. There was no Aryan race. Those concepts don't exist. To say there was a time that if you were to trace back into the ancient roots of ancient Israel, there was actually a time where, folks would be able to follow a bloodline. But essentially anybody can become a Jew. If you wanted to convert, you could easily convert. It's not, and then by Hitler's definition, if you converted, then you were contaminated and defiled. And so there's a saying that says the ism of Judaism is in the blood, which is what they proposed to believe. But really, anyone's blood can be defiled by this contamination. This is what they believe, the Hitler and the Nazis, by converting to Judaism. And so the thing was that Judaism, the philosophy of Judaism was so contrary to German thought, German idealism, that it was considered such a threat that in order for Hitler to carry out and accomplish his goal of basically ruling the earth as some rather intense, and I want to say crazy, champion of the millennium, basically the Messiah in a sense, he had to annihilate the philosophy within Judaism that esteems others higher than oneself. And if you really come right down to the core of Jewish thought, it's that you love your neighbor more than you love yourself. You esteem the other, that the other represents the image of God, that you see the spark of the divine in the face of one's brother, that Cain, when he killed Abel, he was killing the image of God. And then God's question to Cain was, where are you? Where is your brother? What have you done? Same question to Adam, the first man in the Garden of Eden. What have you done? And the Hebrew can actually translate to how could you, interestingly. And I think we all stand, and just as the Nazis stood, we stand accountable in a sense to that form of thinking that says, where are you and what have you done for your brother? And so where is your brother? And have you attended to the need and the care and the thought of other people? So just to give kind of a trace of the trajectory that led to the Holocaust, I need to point out a few things. Primarily that anti-Semitism, at least as a manifestation within Rome and the early Catholic Church onward, was in fact theologically based. And so there was a theological belief that the Jews were cursed, rejected by God, no longer part of the covenant, and they were evil Christ killers. I prefer not to actually read the history that way. In fact, I think it's rather inconsistent. Most of the passages that anti-Semites will use from the Bible to justify hating the Jews, they'll refer to many passages that in the New Testament primarily were either being said to people that were actually there when Jesus was crucified in the stories or in the timeline. So to say, you killed the Christ, maybe they were telling people that were there to kill the Christ within a matter of time after it had actually happened. So to take that and apply it universally to every single Jew after that point, I don't think is very logical. And then, of course, there's many statements in the New Testament from the Apostle Paul writing to many of the churches that were Gentile churches, and those churches were full of people who were not Jewish. However, there was a movement known as the Judaizers who were attempting to make the Gentiles practicing Jews in order to be Christians. So Paul, who was a rabbinic Jew, a Pharisee, in fact, from the tribe of Benjamin, he took a very adamant stance against that practice because his whole point was the Gentiles are grafted into the covenant solely by the blood of Jesus, not by any actions or works according to the old covenant. That didn't apply to Jews because Paul himself does some things in Scripture that lead us to believe he was still a practicing Jew. He shaves his head in the book of Acts, I think 16, I'd have to look it up. And then he takes Timothy and has Timothy circumcised, which is a rite. I know it's an awkward topic, but it is a rite within Judaism. And but he opposes Titus being circumcised because Titus was Greek fully. Timothy was half Greek, half Jew. He was enough Jew in order to need to follow the rituals and rites. All of that is to say, so throughout the history of early Christianity, there was this churning and developing hatred for the Jews that literally carries across many centuries. And I won't go into great depth on the events that happened, but I can point you to some books if that interests you at all and you ever want to know more. A lot of what I just said about early Christianity and Paul, you can find a breakdown of this in a book called The Origins of Anti-Semitism, and that's by John Gager. And that's a really great text if you want to have a more sympathetic reading of Paul that doesn't paint him as an anti-Semite. This is a great book. However, if you want to find an author who paints Paul as an anti-Semite, which I have actually written a response to that in this, critiquing it, kind of basing it on many of the discoveries that John Gager makes in his text. I've kind of put into conversation with Robert Michael here, the late Robert Michael. But this will actually give you a historical trajectory all the way from early Christianity up until Auschwitz. I mean, it gives you an awesome picture of the theological side of anti-Semitism and how it manifested throughout the years. However, there is also the philosophical side. some say the Nazis were, they were Christians. Well, not really. I mean, they really thought they were doing the will of God. In fact, if you read in Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's, his book, is basically the story of his life, called My Struggle in German, Mein Kampf. He says that by annihilating the Jews, he believed he was doing the will of God. So he did believe that. The will of the Lord, I think, was his exact language. But really, the Nazis were steeped in paganism. They were radically, into some pretty wacky stuff, millennial prophecies, and all kinds of, obsession with the Romans and their kind of gods, and just weird stuff. I mean, honestly, I think it's a stretch to say they're a Christian. But the problem is, although the Nazis themselves may not have been Christians, if you look at the general population of Europe at the time, just about everybody was a Christian, more or less. You were either Christian or you were a Jew. Muslims had been sort of driven out of the, a lot of parts of Europe by that time. You probably, at this point, you've had this course, so you should know the history of where the Muslims end up eventually after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, etc. So you've got, you've got this immensely nominal, Christian nominally, which means, it's questionable that any of them were truly practicing Christians, but they all called themselves, many of them, called themselves Christians. They, even through the Crusades, would kill Jews. There would be rioting. There would be burning of the Jewish quarters. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 under Ferdinand and Isabella. They were a Christian Catholic nation. So you see this tension between the Jews and the Christians, and it was always the Christians attempting to annihilate the Jews. So that fabric of the culture, with this deeply ingrained belief that the Jews were both theologically tainted, marked, corrupt, like Cain, that stuck, into building all kinds of mythology surrounding the Jews, believing that they drank the blood of children, that they poisoned the wells, that they had contributed to the cause of the Black Death. So there was this crazy myth that surrounded the mysticism of what it meant to be Jewish. And so when Hitler comes along and he says, let's annihilate the Jews, let's just say it wasn't very hard for many people to look the other way, if not before, actually in favor of the destruction of the Jews. So, like I said, there's a theological tradition that I think was wrong, absolutely. That's my personal perspective, that I think the church fathers, in many regards, we have writings from Tertullian, Justin Martyr, even Augustine, these guys saying negative things, anti-Semitic things against the Jews, and I disagree wholeheartedly with them. I think they were wrong. They were right about some things theologically, I think, in my opinion, but on the whole, they were absolutely wrong in regards to anti-Semitism. And then you come all the way up into the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich and the attempt to annihilate the Jews, and you have a philosophical belief that the Jews are corrupt, they need to be destroyed. But really at the core, it's the German idealism that puts the human will to power as the highest good. And if you're interested in the philosophical stuff, now this isn't light reading, this is deep stuff. You've got German Idealism and the Jew by Michael Mack, and he breaks down some of the Kantian, Hegelian, much of the German philosophy of the time, and kind of points how Jewish thought and being Jewish, the actual being a Jew, was inconsistent and incompatible with German thought. And so it made it very easy to see them as the other foreign, oriental, insignificant other that could be destroyed and annihilated, and that it would be ultimately good if one willed it to be good. And so there you have a little bit of the philosophy, a little bit of the origins of anti-Semitism that explain the fallacy to some of the theological anti-Semitism, and then of course you have the aggressively anti-Christian, holy hatred is what it's called, view of anti-Semitism. And all that is to say, it leads us up to the event itself. And I only brought a couple of books here that I wanted to show, readings that you've actually had from both of these for this chapter are found here in that module for this chapter. And one is from Tadeusz Borowski, who was not Jewish, but he was a World War II prisoner, actually, a political prisoner, and he was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and most of his stories deal with interaction between him and those in the female camp, Auschwitz, which was across the way from where he was. And Primo Levi, this is called Survival in Auschwitz, and this is really probably one of the best. More or less, it's a memoir. I mean, it's basically the story based on his experience there. It's really good. And of course, beyond that, we have Holocaust literature from Elie Wiesel. If you've ever read Night, it's a great text. But I've given you some excerpts in this chapter for this course, for this module. Hopefully you enjoyed those as much as I do. Specifically, the story of the man with the package, and I don't know. When I read that story, it really touched me quite deeply. I thought it was very, sad. And the thing is, and I'll just kind of close on this: the Holocaust is a horrific, terrible, awful, disgusting, morbid thing. But we have a responsibility as humanists, or whatever you want to call studying the humanities as a student. I know you may not consider yourself to be a scholar or a student necessarily of the humanities, but since you're taking my class, I would say you are. And you have a responsibility to the rest of humanity to sometimes look directly into the face of what is abject, what is disgusting, what is grotesque, in order to understand it so that it does not happen again. The sad thing is, there are many in the earth today that if they had their way, there would be another Holocaust. And I do not at all say that with any reserve, and I do not minimize that. In fact, I can suggest you another book if you're interested that deals with that very topic by Dr. Patterson, David Patterson. Do a Google search, and he's got some recent texts that have come out. The metaphysical origins of anti-Semitism is one of them, and he deals with also his view of really the rise of Islam, radical Islam that's going on in the earth today, and how much of even in Palestine, how they want to annihilate the Jews. And I don't say that to be inflammatory or even really try to get a rise politically about the way people view the occupation of Palestine by Israel and this and that. It's not about that. At the end of the day, no one ever can say we must destroy a race, we can even call it that. Nothing in any human sense gives us the right to annihilate a sect or an ethnicity or a religious group. Genocide has not only manifested itself in the Holocaust. We have the Rwandan genocide, we have the Armenian genocide. Genocide on any level is a terrible thing, but we as humans and as students and as scholars, we have a responsibility to study this topic, to understand it, and to do all that we can to see that it never happens again. So part of Holocaust studies is to remember and to not forget what happened. And so I encourage you to take that with you from this lecture, and hopefully remember that anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are very real things, but you can do all that you can do to remember that event and see to it that it never happens again.